The work starts now. This is what the head of the Board of Peace, Nikolai Mladenov, said after announcing an agreement has been reached to disarm Hamas. This comes after months of deadlock in Gaza. U.S. President Donald Trump described it as a historic arrangement. Mladenov said the agreement came after intense negotiations and thanked the UAE, Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, and the U.S. for their efforts. On paper, the roadmap is clear. Hamas weapons will be handed over and its military infrastructure dismantled. Gaza will be run by a technocratic committee and protected by an international security force. But the reality on the ground remains complicated. Hamas wants guarantees for Israel's withdrawal from Gaza, reconstruction of the Strip, and for its own political future. But with mistrust running deep, many challenges arise. How far will Israel withdraw? How much of Hamas's weapons will be handed over? And which comes first? There's also the matter of who will oversee the process. The fate of other armed factions in Gaza also remains unknown, as well as those who have received support from Israel. Still, the announcement marks a milestone in a much-needed peace process in Gaza to offer respite for the people who have had little reprieve from hunger, displacement, and death since October 2023.
That short clip was published online by a news outlet owned by an Emirati and based in Abu Dhabi. It is interesting that in spite of the momentous announcement a few days ago that the Board of Peace had secured the agreement of Hamas to disarm and relinquish power in the Gaza Strip was, well, not covered at all well in the media. For such a high-profile event, that is odd. And there's good reason for that, because the likelihood of this agreement being fulfilled, realized, is, well, very slim. The report you just saw makes it all sound very pat and dry. It is anything but. For a different viewpoint, I offer you this perspective by Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib, born and raised in Gaza, who has emerged in the last 3 years as perhaps the most sober, reflective voice in assessing the situation in the Gaza Strip. He knows Hamas intimately. He literally has skin in the game, and he calls it as he sees it. Here is a short clip from a recent interview he did with the BBC, raising serious questions as to how this agreement, so-called, translates into reality on the ground in the Gaza Strip. Here's Ahmed.
But I will say that the main skepticism that I have is that this disarmament comes a week after the newly appointed leader of Hamas, Khalil al-Hayya, who's aligned with the Islamic Republic of Iran, gave this fiery speech that doubled down on the jihadi narrative, that doubled down on armed resistance. And it didn't really signal any movement from an ethos and a political pragmatism point of view away from armed resistance towards a political strategy. So if that's not coupled with the decision to disarm, I'm very skeptical that this is actually going to survive contact from coming from the outside world where Hamas's negotiators are into the ground where Hamas's guys with guns are, and we know that they have the real authority to implement this.
And now that you have some additional context, we turn to the main event, my discussion yesterday with Jonathan Conricus, FDD Senior Fellow, former IDF Spokesperson, and a retired Lieutenant Colonel with the IDF. He's also a familiar voice to State of Tel Aviv and Beyond followers and subscribers. Conricus and I do some deep dives into 3 issues today. The agreement with Hamas, if there actually is one. We kind of nerd out on domestic Israeli military politics and issues in the middle section. I will ring a bell to warn those of you who might prefer to skip that bit. I mean, it's fascinating, but it may not be everyone's cup of tea. And then we finish off with Iran. I'm sure that you can hear that my voice is a little hoarse. It's a summer cold, but I'm pushing through it. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Let's do this. Monday, August 3rd, late morning. I am somewhere in Central Europe, tucked away. And you, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, are in Israel, and thank you so much for making time to join State of Tel Aviv and Beyond.
Shalom, Vivian. Thanks for having me on.
Always a pleasure. and particularly looking forward to it today because I need to get a level set from you because things are anything but level these days, and perhaps even more so than usual. And there's a clamor from State of Tel Aviv subscribers and followers for the wisdom of Lieutenant Colonel Conricus. So, sir, I want to start with Hamas and the Board of Peace and this announcement that I believe took many off guard, that there had been or has been a negotiated resolution of sorts, that Hamas has agreed with the Board of Peace to pretty much disarm. We'll get into the weeds of what exactly that may or may not mean, and to relinquish power. And in return, Israel is to immediately cease all military action in the Gaza Strip targeting Hamas, and it is to begin to withdraw as certain milestones are reached and demonstrated. I was actually speaking with an individual who is very plugged into Gaza, who is Gazan originally, days before this announcement was made, and our conversation it indicated clearly that this person who's quite plugged in had no idea about what was coming. I don't know if you were in a loop or not, but tell us what you know. What was purportedly agreed upon? Let's start with that.
Okay, so I think it connects with the bigger picture of the situation in the Strait of Hormuz and the stalemate that the U.S. finds itself in. I don't think that the U.S. would push hard for this to happen had there been success elsewhere, but I think the U.S. administration is looking for wins, foreign policy wins, and it's been a long time since UN Security Council Resolution 2803 was adopted, almost a year, and the Trump peace plan, great launch, very glamorous, but then implementation has been woefully short. And by most standards, we are at square one. Square one being Hamas is in control of what's left of the Gaza Strip. Let's say roughly 40% of the Gaza Strip is under Hamas's control. All of the population almost. They're still in control. They're not laying down their weapons. They're not disarming, and nobody's really challenging them. Now, what generated this movement? My assessment, based on the few conversations that I've had and adding one and one together, I see the Qataris and the Turks doing a clever read of the regional and international and American political map and saying, okay, we understand that the situation here is difficult. Let's give something and let's do the usual with evergreen exercise of transferring the burden of proof to Israel instead of having it on Hamas. Because if we look back a few months back, the Board of Peace and Nikolai Mladenov, who heads it, they've been pretty transparent and consistent with focusing on Hamas, that first and foremost there must be disarmament of Hamas. Hamas must lay down their weapons, and only then other things can happen. And that was the tone that we saw over the last few months. And then the Qataris and Turks, they probably understand that is not a good thing, and that will be amount to a lot of pressure. And since they want Hamas to continue, they want Hamas to survive this, but they understand that this is going to be a rough and challenging time, then they said, okay, let's do this maneuver, this tactical maneuver, which allegedly accepts a disarmament of Hamas and tries to immediately apply pressure on the Israelis. Now, if we look into what has been agreed and what was declared by the Board of Peace, by Nikolai Mladenov, it's actually not Israel should withdraw immediately and Israel should stop operating. It says, first and foremost, Hamas needs to lay down their weapons, and it claims that Hamas has agreed to do so. Now, the most important part, from my perspective, other than the fact that Hamas is indeed willing, saying allegedly that they're going to lay down their weapons, which I seriously doubt, but I'll explain in a second. Let's say that they do. From my point of view, what is missing and absolutely crucial is verification. This isn't about storing Hamas weapons, hiding them in, the children's room or the cupboard, or stashing them away in a tunnel or one of the mosques that are left in Gaza. This isn't about just, chucking the green headband of Izzadin al-Qassam brigades and taking, civilian clothing. It's about actually what Israel aspires and what the resolution says. Hamas is supposed to disarm, and Hamas is not supposed to have any influence on the governance of the Gaza Strip. Now, what really is missing from what the Board of Peace is saying is, how are we going to verify that this has indeed happened? Because we've seen this many times over. We know that the modus operandi of Hamas and other jihadi terrorists, other Islamist forces, whether it's in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, we're familiar with the concept of hudna. Hudna is an old Islamic concept. It goes back to the days of Muhammad, the conquest of Arabia by Muhammad and his allies, which basically says, I can agree to a ceasefire, I can sign a ceasefire, which I will knowingly violate once the conditions are in my favor. And the only reason that I'll agree to hudna is because I'm currently not in a good tactical or strategical military position. And we've seen this all over. We've had hudnas with Hamas before. A lot of naive Israeli decision makers have agreed to hudnas, and then we've seen Hamas violate them from the beginning by building military capabilities, by training fighters, by planning, and then by executing attacks that they were not supposed to be doing, but which they prepared all along. So what really is different here is international pressure. The Qataris and the Turks that are providing advice to Hamas on this, Hamas saying, yes, we do, but not doing anything. And then Israel finding itself in a position where we have to do the classic yes, but. Yes, we agree, but we want to see developments on the ground first, and we want to see compliance from Hamas, and we want to see Hamas disarmed, and we want to verify it. Now, where this becomes more challenging, and I think it's also something that the Qataris and Turks are acutely aware of, are Israeli elections. This government and the prime minister is very sensitive now, especially, to be seen as someone who is weak, who is succumbing to international dictates and pressure, and who can do anything that will, jeopardize the future of Israelis. Elections are going to be held on October 27th. That is the month. Well, it's 3 years and 20 days after the worst failure in Israeli history, which happened on their watch. And I think that these things are connected, and that what the Qataris and the Turks and Hamas are trying to do is to pin Israel in a corner and to show the world that Hamas and their camp are actually willing to go forward and help and do things and implement, and then to get the Board of Peace to apply pressure on Israel, and an Israeli government out of a position of, being absolutely paralyzed by fear of being punished electorally by their constituents, doesn't do anything, doesn't say anything, hasn't been communicating. I haven't heard a single Israeli official on record say, this is what Israel thinks about it, this is where we stand, this is what must happen. I've seen briefings from a senior official, which usually is code for Netanyahu, but I haven't seen anybody on record speaking. And always, an information vacuum is usually always used by our enemies against Israel. So on the ground, reality remains pretty much the same. I don't see Hamas disarming. I don't see giant piles of AK-47s in Gaza City. And I don't see Hamas jihadists handing over their weapons. I don't see Hamas handing over maps of their tunnel network and what's left of their military infrastructure. And I don't see Hamas operatives and thugs and internal security officers who have been brutalizing the people in Gaza for about almost 20 years. I don't see them handing over and saying, well, we're now done. We're not going to control the Gaza Strip anymore. The moment a Hamas thug, a terrorist, lays down his weapon, he'll have a problem with Israel, but also, very importantly, he will have a problem with a long list of Gazans that have been assaulted, tortured, have had their families executed and disappeared, and many other horrible things that Hamas is responsible for. And that's another very strong motivation for Hamas not to lay down their weapons. So international diplomacy in kicking in, cynical considerations from the Qataris and the Turks and Hamas, Israeli elections that are limiting Israeli communication and decision-making, and Hamas basically trying to spin the situation. And the ones that are suffering the most, as usual on the ground, civilians in Gaza who, yes, they're getting a lot of parcels of international aid that Israel allows in, but in terms of the living conditions, very challenging. And there's definitely lots of misery there, which, of course, Hamas seeks to amplify and to use for their political gain.
So I want to focus on a few really important points that are embedded in what you just shared with us. A really fantastic high-level sort of overview. It's interesting, to say the least, that there are no verification protocols embedded in or mentioned in this arrangement, ceasefire plan. And I mean, Mladenov, who is operationally heading up the Board of Peace, he is someone who I believe it's fair to say has credibility as being a fair-minded, a moderate. He's not a side taker. I think he has credibility in Jerusalem, clearly has credibility elsewhere. However, what has been proposed based on what you've just shared and it's described is not fair. And what it signals, tell me if I'm wrong, is that Israel has been really frozen out of the discussions leading to this announcement, that Qatar and Turkey are taking precedence, and they definitely have the ear of the chair of the Board of Peace, President Donald Trump, much more so than Prime Minister Netanyahu. And because there is no balance in what you've just laid out for us. And for the Qataris and the Turks, two Islamist nations, yes, I know Turkey's a member of NATO, but we're not doing that today. Two fiercely, proudly, overtly Islamist nations, that they are in effect driving this bus, and that Mladenov is deferring to their preferred strategy, plan, is a little shocking. Start with this, if you would. Was the Israeli establishment, military and political, to the best of your knowledge, included in any of these discussions with respect to this plan? And what does it say to you about the credibility of this Board of Peace as a neutral arbiter?
So I think Mladenov has a proven track record, formerly as an envoy, a UN envoy, which usually is the worst of the worst in terms of people that are sent to the Middle East. But he's a rare anomaly in that sense, actually a person with relevant skills, background, integrity, lots of usual intelligence and a lot of emotional intelligence to be able to communicate with both sides and to be respected by both sides. And that's pretty rare. And I think that it's a good thing that he agreed to take on the probably very Sisyphean and thankless task of chaperoning and pushing the Board of Peace forward. I think it's, the problem is, and it's been for many years, that Israel, under Prime Minister Netanyahu, doesn't present a plan, a strategic plan regarding Gaza. And that creates a void. That creates a void for others to fill. And as you said, there are many eager participants, eager players Qatar and Turkey being two, but they're not the only ones. The Iranians tried for a long time to do it and succeeded with the Islamic Jihad, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and had other influences. So wherever you leave a void, someone else will fill it. And I've said this regarding our strategy versus Egypt as well. I struggle to understand the dealings of the Israeli establishment against Egypt. I think our strategy towards them is a colossal missed opportunity and failure. I think the Egyptians have Gazan blood on their hands, buckets or piles of blood on their hand, because the Egyptians didn't allow refugees out of Gaza very brutally and cruelly. And I think Israel didn't do enough at all to force the Egyptians to do so. So there are many things that are odd. I'd say, the Israeli establishment, on one hand, the IDF, if we're honest, the IDF was told by the cabinet about 2 years ago, your task is to go in, occupy all of Gaza, finish Hamas, finish the war. And the IDF responded, okay, I can do that. Just take into consideration that it will consume almost all of my regular and reserve manpower, and I will not be able to conduct operations protect the border in Lebanon, or to conduct offensive operations against Hezbollah, nor will I be able to do anything effective in Syria, and it'll leave us exposed in other areas, Judea and Samaria, the Jordanian border, etc. And the IDF basically presented that to the cabinet and said, okay, if you want me to do that, I need you to acknowledge the responsibility here and say that I, the cabinet, which is the legal entity in Israel that directs the military what to do, I, the Israeli cabinet, direct you to do that, and I know that the possible consequences are XYZ. Which, of course, is a classic way of getting the politicians to not to do that, because they want to take responsibility. But if we're honest, the Israeli establishment, the IDF and the Ministry of Defense, they didn't want to finish the job in Gaza, and they didn't want to apply the resources, the personnel, and everything else needed in order to really defeat Hamas. And the deal that was made under President Trump was actually, I think, extraordinary in the sense that we got the hostages back. And on paper, it's an excellent deal. On paper, it's a really good deal that I think deals with or positively satisfies about 85% of the things that we need in terms of security and in terms of long-term prospects. Yes, there's a problem with the Palestinian Authority. Yes, there's a problematic linkage that is created between Gaza and Judea and Samaria, that artificial resuscitation of the two-state solution. Right. And there's other problems with it. But on the ground, it could be, if it's implemented on paper, I think a really good deal. And the establishment here, doesn't want really to do the necessary hard work, because it would be extremely ugly, difficult, resource intense, and that's why the deal is, probably as good as is we're going to have it. But what I hear from the Israeli establishment is a lot of void, a lot of quiet. I don't see creative thinking. I don't see Israeli generals or the National Security Council, the general staff, or others really challenging Southern Command. I don't see them challenging the government and saying, we need to drive this. We need to be in the driving seat. We need to dictate what's going forward. We want to, solve this and promote long-term stability and prosperity for Israelis living in the Gaza envelope area and strategically for Israel. Right. I don't see that.
Hang on. Is it the place of the military leadership to publicly challenge the government?
There's way to do things, you use the media. First, the general lines of communication between the higher military echelon and the elected officials is behind closed doors in cabinet meetings and other meetings. That's where that is, of course, supposed to be. But in a case where you as the military see that the inaction of elected leaders in Israel causes damage and creates problems for the future, problems on how to implement good solutions that could be beneficial for Israel, then, there's way to try to influence that. Again, speak directly, but
Right.
also leverage media and leverage other people and communicate that, this needs to happen. And there's more than one way to do that. I always encourage, I believe that professional and national security matters should be dealt with behind closed doors and away from the media. But in some cases, to get things going, either you do it or someone else, like in this case, the Qataris and the Turks,
Right.
and part of the Trump administration, they will do it for you. And then neither the result nor the timing will be to your advantage.
Again, I offer the view of Ahmed Al-Khatib, taken from the same BBC interview that we showed earlier. As does Jonathan Conricus, Al-Khatib expresses skepticism. How can this be implemented, this agreement, when there is no agreed-upon protocol for disarmament? Minor detail. And he also echoes Conricus's concerns regarding the manner in which Hamas operates. The bottom line, he places no trust in Hamas to do what is being discussed. It is simply not in their interest to lay down arms. Here's Ahmed.
Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. Ahmed, like we heard from Shaima there's a lot of questions here about how this is going to play out, what this will look like. Realistically, how can we verify that Hamas and these other groups are going to be disarming?
Well, that's the challenge, is that we absolutely have no real way of doing so, especially because the implementation is going to take hundreds of days, estimates in 200 to 300 days. We're talking about an international security force or stabilization force that needs months to be stood up, a police force for Gaza under NCAG, the Technocratic Transitional Committee, that needs months, if not an entire year, to be ready to enter Gaza. So that's on one end. In the interim, Hamas on the other end will have plenty of time to potentially scheme and put in contingency plans for should multiple phases succeed, but then the final phases fail, to maybe retrieve some of those weapons that it will stash away in hidden away tunnels that we don't know about. So that's going to be the challenge.
All right, so now I'm going to ring the bell, and that forewarns you that we are about to begin, Conricus and I, our inside baseball discussion of friction between the Minister of Defense and the IDF Chief of Staff, and how this is playing out in public. It's fascinating to me. You decide. If you'd like to skip to the Iran bit, it begins at
40 minutes and 21 seconds.
All right, on to Israeli domestic politics. Let me just shift the prism a touch on that issue, because it's a very important issue. I also want to, when you said earlier, well, this agreement gives us kind of 85%, but there's that great 80-20 rule, right? The 80% is always the easy part. It's that last, 15, 20 that where the devil it lies in the details.
Yeah.
But back to the military, leadership using the various means at its disposal to influence, to bring such an important issue into the public domain. It's possible, I suggest, that the IDF Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, has created priorities, and that right now his absolute priority is the draft, and to supplement the quite depleted ranks of conscripts, soldiers. He needs soldiers to do all of the things he's been tasked with doing as the IDF Chief of Staff. And then with respect to kind of longer term strategy, I guess it's a judgment call where he places his chips, so to speak, because if you come out with too many issues, pressing issues, then you're going to just be ignored. It's all noise. If you have 1, 2, maximum 3, you're going to get attention. And I don't want to get deeply into this, but there is, of course, this unfolding mini scandal today where the Minister of Defense, Yisrael Katz, appeared to have announced on Channel 14, the very pro-Likud television station last night, that he was going to terminate the position of a particular general, and he gave reasons. And Eyal Zamir came out and said, no, you're not. Now, that's extraordinary in my experience and understanding. And so Zamir just keeps having these grenades thrown at him from the government. And he's trying to maintain, I think, civilian confidence in the army and then confidence within the army by the soldiers themselves and the leadership. How much and how many places can he insert himself in these public disputes?
Yeah, so I mean, if we go back to how Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir was appointed, and what happened immediately after was that, a chief of staff is appointed for 4 years, and then has the Minister of Defense will then have the ability to extend his reign for another year. And sometimes most of the times that happens, and sometimes it doesn't. But while he's in the position, I wouldn't say he's untouchable, but he's very close to being untouchable unless he presides over a colossal failure like October 7, like his predecessor, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi did. And right from the get-go, Katz, Minister of Defense, who was appointed by Bibi after Bibi threw out or dismissed Yoav Gallant over the same issue of recruitment of the ultra-Orthodox into the IDF. Katz was appointed, and from the beginning, he has been trying to discipline and control the chief of staff, and it's mostly been around issues that are related to nominations. According to protocol and according to the rules, anything above a colonel needs the approval of the Minister of Defense. There's a committee, the chief of staff decides, but it's brought for ministerial approval. And generals are also the same thing, sometimes it's without anything related to the prime minister, but the prime minister here is also part of it because it's a very heavy spin environment here on all sides. You can see politicians that are opposition that are now leaning heavily into this. And I think it's pretty fascinating. I read mostly politics into it. I see, Minister Katz stressed ahead of the Likud primaries. He's been saying a lot of things that have been very, I think, revealing and, to my point, damaging over the last 2-3 weeks in various social and political gatherings that are part of the Likud primary campaign elections. A lot of things that he's done as defense minister, and I'm sure that our enemies, the Mehdi Hassans and others of the world, are already, following it and taking note and filing it, and they will use it against us, various of the things that he has said. And the whole issue of the commander of Central Command, Major General Avi Blut, is in the context of that. And it's in the context of already challenged relationship between Minister Katz and the Lieutenant General, the chief of the IDF. That's the context of it, and there's spin on both sides, I have to say. But what I think is amazing is, how obviously you have people that are critical of the government responding very clearly, saying, why on earth, who are you to, do that on Channel 14 and, dismiss a general? But then, and what I find really interesting is the response of, let's say, coalition voters, the constituents. Avi Blut is an IDF general, but he is really the son of the settlement movement. He studied at Eli, an elite officer, an elite combat officer. He is religious, modern Orthodox, Kippah Sruga in Hebrew context, and he really is son of the settler establishment. I think he was born in Jerusalem, but I think he lives in one of the communities in Judea and Samaria. So when he is targeted by the defense minister in a political kind of spin and move, it's fascinating for me to see that up until now I've seen very vague statements by right-wingers in support of Avi Blut. And I've seen, of course, very strong condemnations in the center and on the left against the clumsy and very odd actions of the defense minister. But what it boils down to is yet another clash, yet another level of friction between the chief of staff and the defense minister. Not the first one and probably not the last one. We've seen this government usually happily use friction with the military, with elected officials, with appointed officials, with senior state officials politically. And I regret that. I think that's a very bad practice. I regret the fact that public servants and Israeli generals, etc., are treated in such a way. And I find it very odd that Katz would have any issue with Avi Blut. You know, when you look at General Blut's record in Judea and Samaria over the last year and a half, it's a phenomenal success. The amount of significant terror attacks are down and are significantly lower than they've been in the last 5-7 years, definitely lower than 23 and 24.
Right.
And the IDF continues to dismantle Hamas and Islamic Jihad infrastructure, does a very good job, relatively small impact on the Palestinian society, but where General Blut is running into difficulties is with violence perpetrated by Israelis.
Exactly.
And that's, of course, something that Katz is sensitive to from the right side of the political map in Israel, and he wants probably to look tough in that sense, which I find really odd because the reality on the ground actually would indicate that there's more need for Israel to do more law enforcement, more rule of law, more control over our own civilians, law and order, than the opposite. But as I said, political times, primaries in the Likud, Katz is running and he's scrambling and doing everything in order to get attention. And what I read in various right-wing groups, etc., he's getting somewhat support, but he's really being criticized at the national level. And it'll be interesting to see what the people in Judea and Samaria have to say about it, because I think Avi Blut has done a very, very good job. And it will be interesting to see what Smotrich will say,
Yes.
because Smotrich has been working hand in hand with Avi Blut, and I think General Blut has done a very good job at providing the military environment that has allowed Israel to really change the lay of the land in Judea and Samaria under Smotrich's guidance and strategy. So it'll be interesting to see, and maybe by the time this podcast comes out, we'll have more clarity. But nasty politics and a general that is caught in the middle.
And I just want to add to that I think that this will play out politically to the detriment of Smotrich for a whole bunch of reasons, and it will benefit possibly Ben Gvir. Of course, Minister Katz wants the benefit to accrue to Likud. But for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with the detail, the issue, you're quite right, it's a matter of record that Avi Blut is very hard right when it comes to settlements, when it comes to the West Bank. But the straw
to be fair, he hasn't said, I think he's a very smart guy, so he keeps away from, voicing political opinions.
Yeah.
But I think, it would be odd if someone who lives in Judea and Samaria and has the background and studied at Eli and many other places, it would be very odd if he had different. And he was, before coming into the job, he was welcomed, embraced by the settler movement, by Israelis in Judea and Samaria as one of their own. Yeah. And I think he's been portrayed like that by Smotrich and by other people. So even though we should be fair and say that he hasn't made political statements per se, but we can assume perhaps where his politics are.
Well, but what he did that caused Minister Katz, it seems, to react in the way he has done is he reintroduced administrative detention for Jewish individuals who are charged with suspected of terrorist-like type offenses. And he brought back in administrative detention after the use of that particular approach had been suspended a few years ago.
By Katz. It was suspended by Katz.
By Katz. And so that seems to have really poked Katz in the wrong way, and seems to have been the catalyst for this latest frisson or conflict between the two. But as I will openly declare my membership in the opposition in the coming election, and you made the point, which is very interesting, that, it's a little paradoxical to have people in the opposition or who are not Likud supporters or hard right supporters, to have them braying about the injustice of it all and how can you touch Avi Blut in this way. And I'm going to make the case here for constitutional integrity, even though we don't have a constitution, we kind of pretend we do. And the absolute critical respect for institutional independence. And that line has been crossed in Israel so many times in the last 4 years with respect to the way in which the government, elected officials, political officials interact with the judiciary, law enforcement, so many other institutions as well. This, to me, is about the integrity of democratic institutions. And I don't care, and I'm an opposition person, I don't care what Avi Blut's views, actions, anything may have been. It strikes me that the manner in which Minister Katz is handling this is not consistent with liberal democratic principles. So that's my beef. And I hope that at least provides some kind of counter fodder to your question or query, as you put it earlier.
Please, by all means.
Let's do it. You know, like to or tend to refer to President Trump these days as Hamlet. You know, to be or not to be, to strike or not to strike. It's become very painful. Just for our listeners' sake, I think I mentioned this to you. I was supposed to have flown out of Israel yesterday, but I moved up my departure by almost a week because I was concerned that my long sojourn to Canada and the States, which I do every year, would not have been possible because the airport, we were worried, was going to be closed for civilian traffic at any moment. So I got out early, which is why I'm here somewhere in Central Europe. But the airport's still open. The airport is still clogged. I saw them with many U.S. Air Force refueling jets as well as combat jets. You could feel the operational strain in the airport as a civilian traveling. It was just very taut and fraught. And many flights have been delayed, of course. It's just much more difficult for them to do everything on the ground. What's going on with President Trump and Iran? We're back on to a deal, apparently, today, I think. What do you think? How do you assess what strikes me as being a lot of obfuscation, a lot of smoke and mirrors, and appearing more and more to be a lack of thoughtful strategy?
So what I think really is the focal issue is the division of power within the Islamic Republic of Iran. That really is it. And I think that we have growing differences and tensions between IRGC and Pezeshkian, Minister of Foreign Affairs and President, and the guys who really are in control, which are generals of the Revolutionary Guard. And IRGC is trying to pull towards a diplomatic solution, or to delay things using diplomacy and keep things within his realm. So what I think is really the focal issue at the heart of the zigzag, confusion, conflicting reports, media briefings, and eventually action on the ground is the growing rift and the differences between the different parts of people who are in power within the Islamic Republic of Iran. We have one part of the regime represented by IRGC and Pezeshkian, maybe Kalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament, Minister of Foreign Affairs, President, and Speaker of the Parliament. These three seem to be leading a certain line that is more about negotiations, is willing to do deals, is willing to open the Strait of Hormuz, and wants to use diplomacy in order to achieve the national goals of the regime. But then on the other hand, the guys who really have their hands on the weapons, on the buttons, and on the levers, and these are a few generals, I don't know their names, but a few generals in the IRGC who appear to have a lot of influence, almost exclusive influence on Mujtaba Khamenei, the supreme leader. And they are the guys who are actually running the country, the ones who decide when and where to fire, when to fire at international ships, and when to fire at countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and they also communicate extensively through various channels. So That, I think, is really the heart of the issue here. The differences, the lack of coordination, and the rivaling camps within the Islamic Republic. And if I had to bet on any of them, sadly, I would bet on the Revolutionary Guard. I think that they have a much stronger structure behind them in terms of budget and power and force, even though IRGC is a very talented and shrewd politician and diplomat with lots of experience. In terms of institutions behind him, he doesn't have it. And I think that what we're going to see is eventually, the decisions here, the hardline decisions, every turn where there's a fork in the road and the Iranian regime will have a dilemma, go a softer way or a harder way. Eventually, I think the upper hand will be of the generals from the IRGC, and we'll see the Iranian state as an entity take the harder line, and that will eventually bring us to military confrontation. What happened here, according to what I read and hear, was that the U.S. was very ready. Many Israeli families, Air Force, Air Defense, officers, etc., as you said, on their way to vacation. This is summertime in Israel, a holiday for the kids, etc. Many vacations were planned, and then Trump tweets that there's going to be strikes, and Washington, the Wall Street Journal, and then other media outlets indicate that it's going to be this weekend. Everybody have to cancel their vacations and plans, elevated readiness, and then apparently the Iranian regime notifies that, yes, we're willing to talk, we'll open the Strait of Hormuz, just don't hit us. And then the U.S. calls off the strikes, Trump calls off the strikes, allegedly also with Saudi, Emirati, Qatari intervention, asking him to do so. I can't verify if that's true or not. But then afterwards, we hear the other side of the Iranian regime, the hardliners, communicating and saying, what are you talking about? We never made any such promise. We're not going to open the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. is violating the agreement. The president is, detached from reality. And at the end of the day, we have this division of power, and that's really what creates the imbalance and the lack of clarity. And what I think is that we will continue to go towards escalation, because I don't think that the more diplomatically inclined deal makers, I don't call them moderates, but those who are more interested in making deals and not using weapons and less hardliners, I don't think that they're going to prevail in Iran. And I think that the generals, the IRGC, are going to drive Iran to the ground by their arrogance, by their lack of willingness to negotiate, by their lack of willingness to open the Strait of Hormuz, and by their aggression against countries. And, if you look at the actions of the IRGC, I think they feel pretty confident. They feel pretty good. They've been expanding. They've been striking new targets. They struck liquid gas targets in Egypt for the first time. They continue to strike all over the Gulf area. They are striking in Jordan. Except for Israel, they're striking roughly everywhere in the Middle East, and they look as if they have a lot of impunity because they understand what eventually the U.S. administration wants. They want the Strait of Hormuz open, they want oil prices down, and they want stability until the midterm, and the IRGC knows that they're in a pretty good situation to mitigate that.
Let me just close with this rather macabre thing, which has been an acceleration of hanging of young protesters who were arrested, detained in January by the IRGC and the Basij. They've been held in prison, and God knows what they've experienced and gone through. And these are young men in their teens, in their 20s. Clearly, this is a very carefully calibrated sort of public relations move, if I can use the term in that way. But there has been a real uptick in the installation of cranes, most recently we know in Isfahan, and the continued hanging of these young men. And that has to be coordinated by the IRGC, I'm going to assume.
Yep.
And I would suspect that the more moderate, not moderate camp, the Pezeshkian and Aragchi camp, probably aren't overly enthusiastic about that. But love to hear your thoughts on that, because I know from the diaspora Iranian Persian crowd, who are obviously in very close contact, many of them with people within the country, this is being received as it's intended to be received by the people. We're in power, we have control, and we're going to continue to hang young people in a public spectacle by cranes. It's hard to think of something more barbaric. Maybe the Taliban stoning women in, soccer
ISIS.
stadiums and
Yeah.
ISIS. But this is pretty extreme conduct. And so we've been kind of, in the kind of stratosphere of leadership, high leadership, and how they calculate. This is gutter on the ground, bottom line, as you like to say, a tactic to intimidate and scare, threaten, terrify the population. Fit that into your paradigm of the IRGC and their messaging also to America and the outside world.
Yeah, I think it fits, sadly, it fits very neatly into that general sense of impunity that the IRGC feels that they can get away with what they used to do before, and that they are well within the boundaries of power to continue their evil oppression of the Iranian people. And that's where it fits in.
And they know that kind of thing really hits hard in the West.
I don't know how hard it hits. I didn't
Really?
see, CNN opening their newscast with it, and I didn't see headlines in the New York Times. Had, Israel done something horrible, then I'm sure that would have been opening news and above the fold. And I think, in general, the Iranian regime, the IRGC knows that Iranian blood is cheap. Unless, of course, it's, taken by Israelis or by Americans. Right. I remember looking at a long investigative, journalistic investigation done by the New York Times about the strike in the beginning of the war, where the U.S. probably, allegedly, inadvertently caused the death of schoolgirls in a school in southeastern Iran. The amount of resources that the New York Times have put into that story, amazing how little they have covered each and every Iranian that has been executed after torture by the Iranian regime, including in the most brutal and gruesome and medieval fashion that you described, hanging people in a town square from cranes in Isfahan and other places. And, I think the regime is getting away with it because they feel that they can. It's not Israel doing it. It's not something that's related to Israel. So there's very little attention. And they probably feel that they are strong enough and powerful enough to get away with it. And there's impunity. And they know that, the Iranian diaspora and Israelis will speak about it. And, true conservatives around the world and true humanists will speak about the people who care about human rights, but the establishment, human rights organizations, allegedly humanitarian organizations, the UN, really nothing. So I think they sadly make a correct assessment in that sense. The only thing that may surprise them will eventually be when the Iranian people will say, well, enough is enough, and they'll start to revolt again. And that point will come. The Iranian regime, the IRGC, will continue to brutalize the Iranian people. They'll continue to oppress, to terrorize, to torture, to execute, and eventually the Iranian people will rise up.
Very recently, for the whole funeral week of Khamenei, there was a very select group of journalists allowed into Iran to cover it, among them 2 New York Times reporters. So that's probably reflective of the esteem in which the regime holds the New York Times, in part because of the work that they've done, which you just described with respect to selective incidents, like this girl's school.
And chaperoned. These journalists were chaperoned and controlled by handlers, by Iranian regime handlers, only to see certain things and speak with certain people. It was a very curated journalistic mission, which I don't think that the New York Times would have been happy to send a journalist to do in any other country, and I think they would have not agreed to be handled, but it agrees to be handled by the Iranian regime, and I think it's not the first time that we see that very basic bias exposed.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, thank you so much, as always, for your insight, for your time, and working hard to get this podcast out tomorrow while it's still very fresh and relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian.
And that's a wrap for today and this week. I'm off to Yodel in the European Alps. Brief sidebar. At the small hotel where I'm staying at the moment, there's a lovely Israeli family. Classic. 3 kids, school age. The parents speak quite excellent, unaccented English to their children as well. Whenever the kids lapse into Hebrew amongst themselves, the parents remind them not to speak in Hebrew. Yes, this is our reality. And me too. In spite of my flawless English and Canadian passport, I have an Israeli phone number. And when you're checking in or ordering an Uber, you never know. Traveling as an Israeli is a singular experience these days. I hope that you're all having a lovely summer, and until next time, stay safe and stay cool.
We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to vivian@stateoftelaviv.com. That's VIVIAN @stateoftelaviv.com. And if you go to our website, stateoftelaviv.com, you can find the subscribe button and take it from there. Hope that you do that. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything. Thank you, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team, and thank you, listeners, for being here. Until next time, stay safe.